The heavy oak doors of the cathedral swung open with a hollow sound, and for 3 endless seconds, every camera flash in the room went blindingly bright. I stood in the 5th row, wearing a gray wool coat, my hands tucked into my pockets, watching my younger sister walk down the aisle in the exact lace wedding gown I had spent 6 months custom ordering from Milan. She held the bouquet of white peonies I had paid for, and, at the altar, the man I had been engaged to for 3 years reached out to take her hand with a triumphant smile. The priest did not even hesitate as he asked if anyone objected, completely unaware that the marriage license signed in the back room 5 minutes earlier was tied to a joint financial guarantor whose authorization I had quietly revoked at 4 o'clock that morning. I did not scream, I did not throw a scene, and I did not ruin their photos. Instead, I stood completely still as the cold air rushed into the chapel, reached inside my coat pocket, and smoothed my thumb over the heavy brass key to the penthouse they were planning to sleep in tonight. Tell me, if the person you loved and the sister you raised stole your entire wedding day behind your back, would you cause a scene at the altar, or would you let them sign the papers and destroy them in silence? My name is Audrey Prescott. I am 32 years old, and for 8 long years, I served as the quiet financial shield for a family that confused my silence for obedience, completely unaware that every single luxury they touched belonged strictly to my sole personal estate. For 8 years, I functioned as the invisible foundation of the Prescott family, carrying the entire weight of their financial ambitions while they treated my sacrifices as a basic birthright. When our father passed away 9 years ago, he left the family business in a fragile state, burdened by mismanaged investments and mounting tax liabilities. I was 23 years old, fresh out of my master's program in corporate finance, and instead of taking a lucrative job offer at a global investment firm in New York, I stepped in to clean up the mess. I structured the Prescott Family Trust, audited 7 years of back taxes, and built a capital holding framework that saved our ancestral home and funded every single commercial venture my family attempted thereafter. But in the eyes of my mother, Eleanor, and my younger sister, Chloe, my labor was never viewed as talent or sacrifice. To them, I was simply the designated caretaker, the emotionless bean counter, whose sole purpose was to keep the money flowing while they pursued their passions. Over those 8 years, I funneled over $6,000 every single month directly into maintaining Chloe's lavish lifestyle. I paid for her 5-year tenure at a private design academy that she ultimately dropped out of, covered her $3,000 monthly apartment rent in the Arts District, and leased a luxury European crossover SUV in my name so she could maintain the image of a successful fashion consultant. Whenever Chloe wanted to launch a new boutique or host an exclusive gallery evening, Eleanor would sit me down at the dining table, lay a guilt-inducing hand on my arm, and remind me that as the older, high-earning sister, it was my moral duty to give Chloe a safety net. What Eleanor conveniently ignored was that Chloe's safety net was built entirely out of my late-night financial audits, skipped holidays, and personal savings. When Chloe racked up $42,000 in credit card debt during a 2-month shopping trip in Paris and London, Eleanor did not reprimand her. Instead, she brought the bills to my desk crying that Chloe was too fragile for legal notices and that a good sister would step in to protect her credit score. I paid every single cent, swallowing my pride, believing that eventually my loyalty would earn me a place of genuine warmth in my own family. The double standards reached an insufferable peak when Julian Cross entered my life 3 years ago. Julian was a talented but struggling independent architect who lacked the capital to secure high-value commercial contracts. I fell in love with his drive and his vision, and because I believed partnership meant lifting each other up, I put my full financial weight behind his firm. I personally co-signed a $400,000 commercial credit line for Cross Architecture, leveraged my professional contacts to introduce him to high-net-worth developers, and secured the lease on a prestigious penthouse office downtown. But every time we hosted family dinners, Eleanor and Chloe would openly undermine my relationship. Chloe would make passive-aggressive remarks about how my demanding corporate schedule made me a boring, rigid partner, subtly flirting with Julian across the dinner table while I was in the kitchen clearing the plates from 12 guests. When Julian proposed to me 8 months ago with a modest antique ring, I thought I had finally found a quiet sanctuary away from my family's entitlement. I took on the entire burden of planning the wedding, transferring $200,000 of my personal savings into a designated wedding account to cover the venue, the top-tier caterers, and the custom bridal gown from Milan. But 6 weeks before the ceremony, after I spent a brutal 48-hour shift handling a corporate audit, I came home with a high fever and a severe migraines. I called Julian asking him to bring over basic medication only to be told he was busy helping Chloe select interior finishes for her new studio. When I asked my mother for help, she scolded me for being demanding, telling me that Chloe's career was at a critical turning point and that a strong woman like me could handle a fever alone. I lay in the dark that night, shivering in my own bed, blind to the fact that while I was funding their comfort, they were already laying the groundwork to replace me entirely. The breaking point arrived on a freezing Thursday morning at 4 o'clock, exactly 72 hours before I was scheduled to walk down the aisle. I woke up in my quiet apartment with a strange, persistent knot in my stomach. Julian had not returned home the previous night, claiming through a brief text message that he was pulling an all-nighter at his architecture studio to finalize a critical structural presentation for a commercial client. Unable to sleep, I pulled on my silk robe, booted up my corporate laptop at the kitchen island, and poured a mug of black coffee. As the primary financial controller of the Prescott Family Trust, I routinely ran routine compliance checks on our liquid accounts every month. But that morning, a sudden discrepancy in the secondary liquidity reserves caught my eye, a six-figure variance that had not been flagged on the mid-month summary. My hands were completely steady as I logged into the primary banking portal using my master's security clearance to bypass the simplified client dashboard. What I uncovered over the next 4 hours was not a series of careless accounting mistakes. It was a systematic, calculated scheme of financial treason executed by the three people I trusted most. The first discovery made my pulse run cold. 18 days prior, Julian had submitted a fraudulent credit modification request to our commercial lender, leveraging my personal stock portfolio as collateral for a $250,000 business loan. Attached to the digital application was a forged authorization letter bearing my full legal signature, digitized and stamped without my knowledge. He had used my credit score to secure capital for a high-risk luxury development firm that had quietly failed 2 weeks earlier. Digging deeper into the Prescott Family Trust ledgers, I uncovered a second, even more sinister betrayal. Over the past 4 months, my mother, Eleanor, using her secondary administrative access, had executed 3 massive wire transfers labeled emergency maintenance. Exactly $180,000 of my personal inheritance had been siphoned directly into a private offshore account registered under Chloe's name. But the ultimate shock came when I queried the county registry database and the venue contract logs for my upcoming wedding. 6 days earlier, Julian and Chloe had met with the head event coordinator at the cathedral. Using a forged power of attorney form, they had removed my name from the official marriage license filing and substituted Chloe's legal name on every single document. My mother had authorized the transfer of my custom Milanese dress, my reserved bridal suite, and the entire $200,000 reception package directly to my sister. They were planning to stage a sudden dramatic announcement at the altar, publicly presenting Chloe as Julian's true bride while painting me as a bitter, unstable careerist who had abandoned her fiancé right before the ceremony. A razor-sharp clarity settled over my chest as the initial shock faded into icy resolve. I opened a fresh spreadsheet and began a meticulous forensic audit of every financial account, asset title, and corporate guarantee linked to my name. Line by line, entry by entry, I mapped out the total sum of their exploitation. $642,000 of stolen capital, forged signatures, and unauthorized asset liens. But they had made one fatal calculation. They assumed I was an obedient, emotional victim who would freeze under the weight of public humiliation. They forgot that as an expert financial controller, I retained sole legal ownership over the trust's underlying master assets, the physical cathedral venue lease, and the cross-collateral guarantees on Julian's architecture firm. I printed out 3 pristine copies of the forensic audit, attached certified copies of the bank signature cards proving forgery, and secured the documents inside a heavy leather binder. Then, with a series of deliberate clicks, I logged into the central clearing system. I did not cancel the wedding venue or alert the caterers. Instead, I quietly revoked my personal guarantor status on Julian's commercial loan, placed an immediate legal freeze on the trust's secondary payout accounts, and instructed my private security firm to rekey the oceanfront penthouse where Julian and Chloe planned to begin their new life together. The ATM was officially closed, and the trap was silently set. The 72 hours leading up to the ceremony were a masterclass in psychological warfare and calculated manipulation. By noon on Friday, my corporate phone began vibrating relentlessly on my desk. The automated notification system had dispatched formal alerts regarding the frozen secondary accounts and the revoked guarantor status. Julian attempted to call me 14 times in less than an hour. When I declined every call, letting them go straight to voicemail, his tone shifted rapidly from artificial concern to sharp, demanding irritation. He sent a series of lengthy text messages claiming that a temporary technical glitch at the bank was threatening his firm's payroll and demanding that I log into the portal immediately to sign an urgent liquidity waiver. He played the devoted partner, reminding me how much we had built together, while casually attaching refinancing documents for me to sign under the pretense of securing our joint future. When I arrived at my mother's estate that evening to retrieve my personal belongings, I was met with an orchestrated ambush. Eleanor and Chloe were waiting in the formal living room, flanked by two influential family relatives. My mother did not ask how I was coping with the wedding stress or why I had been staying at a hotel. Instead, she cornered me near the foyer, her voice tight with suppressed rage, demanding to know why Chloe's secondary credit card had been declined at a luxury bridal boutique. Chloe sat on the velvet sofa, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, putting on a dramatic performance of emotional distress. She accused me of being a bitter, resentful older sister who was intentionally sabotaging her happiness because I was jealous of her youth and her artistic freedom. When I stood my ground, folded my arms, and calmly told them that every secondary credit line had been permanently revoked, my mother deployed the toxic gaslighting tactic she had perfected over decades. She stepped directly into my personal space, lowering her voice to a cold, condescending whisper. She told me that I was working too hard, that my demanding corporate career was making me emotionally unstable and paranoid. She claimed that my long hours had driven Julian away, and that as a family, they were simply stepping in to fix a situation that my neglect had created. She had the audacity to suggest that if I truly loved Julian and cared about my family's reputation, I would step aside gracefully, sign over the wedding venue rights to Chloe, and pretend the entire arrangement was my own selfless gift to my younger sister. Within hours, the pressure campaign expanded across our entire extended family network. A massive barrage of guilt-inducing messages flooded the family group chat of 14 people. Relatives I had not spoken to in months began calling my personal line, leaving sobbing voicemails about how my cold-hearted behavior was breaking my mother's heart and disrespecting my late father's memory. They accused me of hoarding money out of pure spite, claiming that my financial boundaries were a sign of emotional instability. My mother even contacted two senior board members at my financial firm, dropping subtle hints that I was suffering from a nervous breakdown and might need an emergency leave of absence. They truly believed that by threatening my professional reputation, overwhelming me with social guilt, and isolating me from my peers, I would break down, apologize, and quietly restore access to my bank accounts. Every insult, every manipulative lie, and every desperate threat only solidified my resolve, proving that I was not dealing with a family, but with a nest of extortionists who had mistaken my quiet patience for permanent weakness. The turning point arrived on Saturday morning, less than 24 hours before the scheduled ceremony. I was sitting in the quiet library of a boutique hotel downtown, reviewing my legal notes, when my personal phone rang with a number I had not seen in nearly 4 years. When I answered, the calm, gravelly voice of Marcus Sterling greeted me. Marcus was a 68-year-old veteran estate attorney and the co-trustee of the original Prescott Family Trust, a man who had stepped away from active practice after a bitter disagreement with my mother over her reckless spending habits years ago. He explained that he had received a frantic visit earlier that morning from my mother, who had tried to convince him to override my administrative block on the trust's primary capital reserves. Instead of accommodating her demands, Marcus had listened quietly, recognized the signs of a hostile financial takeover, and immediately initiated an independent verification of the trust records. An hour later, I met Marcus in his private office on the top floor of an historic building downtown. He sat behind a dark mahogany desk, holding a heavy leather binder tied with a faded navy ribbon. Inside were the original unamended trust deeds drafted by my late father 15 years prior, complete with certified codicils that my mother had assumed were lost during our corporate restructuring. Marcus laid out the entire paper trail with surgical precision. My father had anticipated the exact dynamic that had unfolded. He had explicitly structured the trust so that sole operational authority transferred exclusively to me upon my 30th birthday, rendering any secondary modifications attempted by my mother legally void without my written, notarized consent. Furthermore, Marcus presented verified bank correspondence showing that Julian Cross had attempted to bribe a junior loan officer to bypass the verification protocol on my forged signature. Hearing the cold, recorded details of how my fiancé and my mother had plotted to declare me legally incompetent to seize full operational control of my estate completely erased every remaining trace of guilt or hesitation in my heart. Marcus leaned across the desk, rested his hands on the binder, and assured me that with these verified originals in our possession, we held an absolute, unchallengeable checkmate. We did not merely possess a legal defense. We held the power to strip them of every asset, credit line, and property title they had exploited for nearly a decade. For 8 years, I had mistakenly believed I was fighting alone against a network of people who treated my generosity as weak vulnerability. But looking at Marcus, I realized that true loyalty cannot be bought with monthly wire transfers or fake family solidarity. It is forged through genuine integrity. With the full legal dossier secured and an airtight strategy prepared, the heavy anxiety that had weighed on my chest for months completely vanished, replaced by a razor-sharp determination to execute absolute justice. The climax did not happen with a chaotic shouting match in the crowded aisle or a dramatic scene in front of the altar. It unfolded with absolute surgical precision in the soundproof glass VIP lounge behind the cathedral nave, 30 minutes after the ceremony concluded. Julian and Chloe walked into the room looking smug, triumphant, and completely intoxicated by their perceived victory. Chloe was still wearing my custom Milanese lace gown, holding a glass of vintage champagne, while Julian held her hand, casually adjusting his designer tuxedo. My mother, Eleanor, followed closely behind, wearing a proud, triumphant smile, fully believing I had been completely defeated and forced to watch my own life stolen from the back rows. I sat completely motionless at the head of the polished oak conference table, wearing my tailored charcoal suit, flanked by Marcus Sterling on my left and a senior court bailiff on my right. The room went dead silent as I looked at the 3 people who had spent 8 years bleeding me dry. Before I hand over the final legal dossier that will dismantle their delusion forever, ask yourself this. If you discovered that your own sister and fiancé had conspired to steal your wedding day and forge your signature for hundreds of thousands of dollars, would you confront them publicly in front of all their guests or hand them the legal papers in private and walk away? I did not offer a single word of warning. Marcus simply slid a thick navy folder containing 14 crisp, notarized pages across the glass table. Page 1 was the certified forensic audit detailing the $642,000 siphoned from my personal accounts over the years. Page 2 was the official trust registry confirmation proving my absolute, unchallengeable sole ownership of every underlying capital reserve, including the family estate. Pages 3 through 10 contained the bank fraud reports detailing Julian's forged signatures, the unauthorized wire transfers to Chloe's offshore account, and certified copies of the criminal fraud reporting notices submitted to the state attorney's office at 9 o'clock that morning. As Julian flipped through the documents, the arrogant smile completely melted from his face, replaced by a sickly, pale terror. Chloe reached over to snatch the papers, but her hands began shaking uncontrollably as she read the bold red notice on the final page. An immediate court-ordered freeze on every bank account, credit line, and asset linked to her name, paired with an official eviction order for the oceanfront penthouse. Marcus leaned forward and explained in a calm, icy tone that because the wedding venue lease and the cathedral event deposit were paid exclusively through my personal accounts, the marriage license signed earlier was legally detached from any shared marital property rights. Julian's architecture credit lines were officially revoked, triggering an immediate acceleration clause from the bank that required full repayment within 48 hours or involuntary bankruptcy proceedings would begin. Chloe burst into hysterical tears, begging my mother to fix it. But Eleanor stood completely paralyzed, realizing that the master key to the family fortune had been permanently turned against them. Julian fell to his knees beside my chair, stuttering desperate apologies, claiming he had been manipulated, begging me not to ruin his career. I looked him dead in the eye, unscrewed my fountain pen, and signed the formal legal execution order. I told him that the bank was permanently closed, the trust was sealed, and the load-bearing wall they had exploited for 8 years had finally stepped out of their way. Without waiting for a response, I gathered my coat, thanked Marcus, and walked out into the crisp afternoon air, leaving them trapped in the silence of their self-inflicted ruin. 4 months have passed since that frozen afternoon in the cathedral conference room, and the quiet that has settled over my life is a profound peace I had forgotten existed. The financial and legal consequences for my family were swift and unyielding. Unable to meet the immediate 48-hour repayment clause on his revoked $400,000 commercial credit line, Julian Cross's architecture firm was forced into involuntary liquidation. His reputation in the design community was permanently ruined when the bank's forensic audit confirmed the forged authorization documents. He was forced to sell his office equipment at a loss and move into a cramped, noisy studio apartment on the outskirts of the city, working long hours as a junior draftsman just to service his remaining personal debts. Chloe's dream of a glamorous, subsidized lifestyle collapsed overnight. Without my monthly trust allowances to pay her rent or cover her luxury SUV lease, she was forced to liquidate her designer wardrobe to pay off her back taxes. She now works 2 retail jobs at a shopping mall, living with my mother in a tiny 2-bedroom rental outside the city. The endless parade of manipulative phone calls, guilt-inducing group chat messages, and sobbing voicemails stopped completely the moment Marcus Sterling enforced the formal court orders, making it crystal clear that any further harassment would result in immediate criminal prosecution for wire fraud. As for me, I spent the first few weeks enjoying the simple, untroubled silence of my own estate. I restructured the Prescott Family Trust into an independent philanthropic foundation, allocating resources toward educational scholarships for young women pursuing careers in finance and law. Every morning, I sit on my quiet balcony with a steaming mug of black coffee, breathing in the fresh air without the crushing weight of anxiety that used to paralyze my chest. Living through this ultimate betrayal taught me a lesson that no corporate finance degree could ever impart. Those who praise you for being a strong, selfless load-bearing wall are usually the very same people who have decided they will never carry their own weight. Generosity should always be a choice born of love, never an obligation forced through emotional manipulation. And setting strict financial boundaries is not an act of selfishness, but the ultimate declaration of self-respect. If you ever find yourself being manipulated into giving up your peace to fund someone else's comfort, remember my story? Look at the legal deeds in your life and never be afraid to show them whose name is actually on the title.